The observatory dome opened, and the night sky revealed patterns he'd never seen before, except he had seen them thousands of years ago, when the islands still existed, when the stars aligned differently, when civilization reached heights humanity would spend millennia trying to remember. The therapist's voice was soft, rhythmic, pulling him deeper into relaxation. David felt his body melting into the chair, his muscles releasing tension he didn't know he'd been carrying. His breathing slowed to almost nothing. His thoughts, usually racing with calculations and theories, went quiet. And then something strange began to happen. The darkness behind his closed eyes started to shift, to shiver with colors that didn't have names. He felt himself moving backward through time, not in years or decades but in vast sweeps of centuries and millennia. The air around him changed. It felt thicker, heavier, charged with energy that made his skin tingle. He could smell salt water and something else, something he couldn't identify but that felt ancient and powerful. And he could hear sounds filtering through from another time. Not modern sounds of cars and electronics, but older sounds. Waves crashing, wind moving through stone corridors, voices speaking in a language his conscious mind didn't know, but that his deeper awareness understood perfectly. His feet touched solid ground, and he opened his eyes to see a world that shouldn't exist. David Harrison had been obsessed with Atlantis his entire life, not in a conspiracy theory way, but with genuine academic curiosity that bordered on compulsion. He was an astronomer and physicist, respected in his field, with multiple published papers on ancient astronomical knowledge, but his true passion, the thing that drove him even when he tried to ignore it, was understanding how ancient civilizations possessed astronomical knowledge they shouldn't have had. The Antikythera mechanism, the precise astronomical alignments of the pyramids, the Mayan calendars, sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles, stone circles positioned to track stellar movements with impossible accuracy. Over and over, ancient sites demonstrated knowledge of the cosmos that supposedly primitive people couldn't have possessed. David's rational mind tried to explain it through lost knowledge, through gradual accumulation of observations over centuries, but part of him, a part he rarely acknowledged, suspected something more, something about a source civilization, an older culture that had achieved scientific heights and then disappeared, leaving only fragments that later societies struggled to understand. He didn't call it Atlantis publicly, that would damage his academic credibility, but privately, alone at night, studying ancient star maps and astronomical records, he wondered, what if the legends were real? What if there had been a civilization that understood the cosmos in ways we were only beginning to relearn? 3 months ago, David had been working late in his university office when he'd discovered something that shook him. He'd been comparing ancient Egyptian astronomical records with Mayan calendars and Sumerian tablets, looking for correlations, and he'd found a pattern, a specific arrangement of stellar observations that appeared in all 3 cultures, despite being separated by continents and thousands of years. But it wasn't just the correlation that disturbed him, it was the recognition. When he plotted the stellar positions these ancient cultures were recording when he recreated the night sky as it would have appeared from their perspective, at the time periods indicated, he felt a jolt of familiarity, so intense it made him dizzy. He knew this pattern. Somehow, impossibly, he recognized it, not from his studies but from somewhere deeper, somewhere that predated his current life. That's when the dreams had started. Almost every night, he found himself in a place he'd never been but that felt more like home than anywhere he'd ever lived. A coastal city with buildings made of white stone and crystal, an observatory with a dome that opened to reveal the stars, and always, the sense that he'd lived there, worked there, studied the cosmos from that place thousands of years before he was born, as David Harrison. His wife suggested he see someone about the dreams, worried he was having a breakdown from stress and overwork. David agreed, but not for the reasons she thought. He needed to understand what these dreams were showing him, and he'd found Dr. Helen Reeves, a therapist who specialized in past life regression and who had a background in archaeology, making her uniquely qualified to work with someone like David. Now, standing in this impossible place with ancient stone beneath his feet and an alien sky above him, David understood. The dreams weren't dreams, they were memories. Memories of a life lived in a civilization that history claimed never existed. Atlantis. He was remembering Atlantis. David's awareness settled fully into this other body, this other life. His name was Marin. He was 34 years old, though age was counted differently here. He was a keeper of the stars, what in David's modern world would be called an astronomer, though the role encompassed far more than just observation. Marin lived in the city of Poseidia, the central city of Atlantis, located on the largest of the 10 islands that comprised the Atlantean civilization. The year, by modern reckoning, would be approximately 10,000 BCE, though such dating was meaningless in this context. This was a time before most of recorded history, before the civilizations that modern archaeology recognized. The city spread out before him was nothing like the ruins David had spent his life studying. This was Atlantis at its peak, a thriving metropolis that combined advanced technology with architectural beauty that took his breath away. Buildings were constructed from a white stone that seemed to glow from within, particularly at sunset when the stone caught and amplified the fading light. But these weren't just stone structures. They incorporated crystal technology that David's modern mind struggled to understand. Large crystals, positioned strategically throughout the city, that somehow generated and distributed energy, that purified water, that even influenced weather patterns. The technology wasn't mechanical in the way David understood machines. It was based on principles of resonance, vibration, consciousness interacting with matter. The Atlanteans had discovered that reality was far more malleable than later civilizations would believe, that directed consciousness and specific frequencies could influence physical matter in ways that seemed like magic but were actually advanced science. Marin walked through the streets toward the central observatory where he worked. The streets were wide and clean, paved with smooth stone interlaid with what looked like gold, but was actually a copper-gold alloy that conducted energy through the city's infrastructure. Water flowed through channels on either side of the streets, part of an elaborate system that managed fresh water distribution and waste removal with remarkable efficiency. The people he passed were diverse, reflecting Atlantis's position as a hub where different races and cultures converged for trade and learning. Some had skin as dark as ebony, others as pale as the white stone buildings. Some were tall, others short. Some dressed in simple tunics, others in elaborate robes that indicated their roles in society. But what struck David most was the consciousness level. These people carried themselves with a presence, an awareness that was different from modern humans. Less separation between individual and collective. Less fear. More connection to the natural world and to each other. They hadn't yet experienced the fall into dense materialism that would characterize later civilizations. Marin reached the observatory, a massive circular building topped with a crystalline dome that could open to reveal the sky. He climbed the spiral stone stairs, running his hand along the wall where symbols were carved. Not decorative symbols, but a language. The Atlantean written language that combined pictographs with mathematical notation, expressing complex ideas in single characters. At the top of the stairs, he entered the observation chamber. The dome was currently closed, the ceiling glowing with soft light generated by the crystals embedded in the structure. Around the circular room, other keepers of the stars were working at their stations, consulting star maps, making calculations, recording observations. Marin moved to his station, where thick sheets of a paper-like material waited. This wasn't true paper, which wouldn't be invented for thousands of years. It was made from processed seaweed, creating a durable surface that could hold detailed drawings and notes. On these sheets, Marin and his colleagues were creating comprehensive maps of the night sky, tracking the movements of planets and stars, calculating cycles and predicting celestial events. But their work went beyond simple observation. The Atlantean astronomers understood something that most modern scientists had only begun to rediscover. The cosmos was alive, conscious. The movements of celestial bodies weren't just mechanical responses to gravitational forces. They carried meaning, information, energy that influenced life on Earth in measurable ways. The positions of stars and planets at the moment of a person's birth influenced their energy field, their consciousness, their life path. Not in a deterministic way. Human will was always free, but in the way that a river's current influences a boat. You could still steer wherever you wanted, but you'd be working with or against particular forces. Understanding these influences allowed the Atlantean priests and healers to work with individuals more effectively, to time important events for maximum beneficial influence, to help people align with cosmic rhythms rather than fighting against them. This wasn't superstition. It was sophisticated science based on detailed observation and mathematical precision. Marin spent the morning updating his star charts, noting the current positions of the visible planets. Mars was moving through what would later be called Leo, Jupiter was approaching conjunction with Saturn, an event that happened only once every 20 years and that carried significant energetic implications for the collective consciousness of humanity. His colleague Thomas approached a woman about 10 years his senior, who specialized in lunar cycles and their influence on tides, weather, and female biology. She'd noticed something unusual in her observations that she wanted Marin's perspective on. The moon's orbit was showing subtle irregularities, she explained using the flowing Atlantean language that combined verbal sounds with hand gestures for precision. Nothing dramatic, but measurable deviations from the predicted path. She wondered if this might indicate some shift in the Earth's magnetic field or some other factor they had accounted for. Marin studied her data carefully. He cross-referenced it with his own observations of stellar positions, checking whether other celestial bodies showed similar anomalies. They didn't, which meant the irregularity was specific to the Moon or to the Moon-Earth relationship. He suggested they consult with Charis, the eldest keeper of the stars, who had been observing the heavens for over 60 years and might have historical perspective on whether such irregularities had occurred before. They found Charis in the library section of the observatory, a vast room filled with shelves holding thousands of the seaweed paper documents containing centuries of astronomical observations. The old man was reviewing records from 300 years earlier, part of his ongoing project to identify long-term cycles that spanned multiple human lifetimes. When presented with Tannis's findings, Charis listened carefully, then moved to a specific shelf and retrieved a particular document. He unrolled it slowly, revealing star charts from nearly 400 years prior, and there, in the notes, was mention of similar lunar irregularities that had persisted for about 5 years before the ancient keeper explained that such fluctuations seemed to be related to the crystal energy systems that powered Atlantean civilization. The massive crystals, particularly the Great Fire Crystal in the temple at the center of the city, generated enormous amounts of energy. This energy occasionally influenced the Earth's magnetic field in subtle ways, which in turn could affect celestial mechanics on a small scale. The irregularities weren't dangerous, Charis assured them, but they should be monitored and recorded for future reference. Knowledge was the most valuable resource Atlantis possessed, and maintaining accurate records ensured that wisdom accumulated rather than being lost with individual lifetimes. David experienced all of this through Marin's consciousness. Fascinated by the level of astronomical sophistication, these people understood orbital mechanics, magnetic fields, energy influence on matter. They had achieved scientific knowledge that humanity wouldn't relearn for 12,000 years. But Marin's work wasn't just academic. In the afternoon, he had a consultation with a young couple planning to conceive a child. They wanted guidance on the most auspicious timing based on celestial influences. This was common practice in Atlantis. Approaching conception with the same intentionality and awareness that was brought to all major life decisions, Moran reviewed the couple's birth charts, understanding the energetic patterns they each carried. Then he calculated upcoming celestial configurations, looking for alignments that would complement their energies and provide beneficial conditions for a new soul to incarnate. He recommended they wait until the new moon in 2 months, when Jupiter would be in a harmonious relationship with Venus and the Sun. That configuration would support the manifestation of a soul with balanced masculine and feminine energies, with natural leadership abilities tempered by compassion and artistic sensibility. The couple thanked him, presenting him with a small crystal as payment. Not currency in the modern sense. Atlantis didn't use money, but specific crystals had value based on their energetic properties and could be exchanged for goods and services in a sophisticated barter system. As evening approached, Marin prepared for the night's observational work. The dome would open after sunset, allowing direct viewing of the stars. Tonight was particularly important because they were tracking a comet that appeared only once every 76 years. Future civilizations would call it Halley's Comet, but the Atlanteans had been tracking it for over 1,000 years, noting its predictable return and understanding it as a celestial messenger carrying specific energetic influences. While waiting for darkness, Marin stood on the observatory's outer platform, looking out over the city and the sea beyond. Poseidia was built on elevated ground, with the temple and observatory at the highest point. From here, he could see the entire city spreading out below, the white buildings glowing in the late afternoon light, the carefully planned circles and canals that distributed water and energy throughout the urban space. Beyond the city, the ocean stretched to the horizon, Atlantis was positioned in what would later be called the Atlantic Ocean. Though the sea level and continental configurations were different then, the civilization comprised 10 major islands, each with its own city and specialized focus, all connected by an advanced seafaring culture that traded with distant lands. Marin could see ships in the harbor, vessels that used both sail and crystal-powered propulsion, capable of crossing vast ocean distances with speed and reliability that would not be matched for thousands of years. Those ships brought copper from lands to the west, tin from lands to the east, knowledge and ideas from cultures around the world. Atlantis was the center of a global civilization, a hub where the best minds gathered to share and advance knowledge. But it was also, Marin knew with a heaviness in his heart, approaching a time of crisis. There were tensions in Atlantean society that had been growing for generations. The civilization had split into two general philosophical camps. One group, which Marin belonged to, believed that technology and power should be used in harmony with natural law, with respect for the sacred nature of life and consciousness. The other group, growing in influence, believed that the technology should be pushed further, that human will should dominate nature rather than working with it, that power should be used for conquest and control rather than cooperation and growth. This wasn't just philosophical disagreement. It had practical implications. The crystal technology that powered Atlantean civilization was incredibly potent, capable of manipulating matter and energy at fundamental levels. In harmonious hands, it created abundance and beauty, but it could also be weaponized, could be used to control others, could be pushed beyond safe limits in pursuit of greater power. The Sons of Belial, as the power-focused faction called themselves, were pushing for more aggressive use of the crystals. They wanted to tune them to higher frequencies that would generate more energy, that could be projected as weapons, that could even be used to manipulate weather and geological forces. The Sons of the Law of One, the faction Marin supported, warned that pushing the technology too far would destabilize the entire system. The crystals worked by resonating with Earth's natural energy grid. Disrupting that resonance could have catastrophic consequences, not just for Atlantis but for the entire planet. But the Sons of Belial were winning politically. They had the support of wealthy merchants who wanted military power to protect trade routes. They had the backing of younger priests who had been seduced by promises of greater abilities and influence. They were charismatic and convincing, framing their opposition as fearful and backward-looking. Marin and his colleagues in the observatory saw the warning signs in the heavens. The celestial configurations pointed toward a time of upheaval, of choices that would have lasting consequences. They had presented their findings to the ruling council, but the council was divided, unable to reach consensus on how to proceed. As darkness fell and the observatory dome opened to reveal the star-filled sky, Marin felt a sense of foreboding. He loved this work, loved studying the cosmos and helping others align with its rhythms. But he feared that the knowledge his civilization had accumulated over thousands of years was about to be lost, destroyed by the hubris of those who thought they could dominate nature rather than work in partnership with it. The comet appeared right on schedule, exactly where Marin's calculations had predicted. It was bright and beautiful, its tail streaming across the sky like a river of light. The assembled keepers of the stars watched in silence, each making their own observations, their own notes, their own interpretations of what this celestial visitor might signify. Marin recorded the comet's position carefully, noting its brightness, its angle, its relationship to the surrounding stars. And as he worked, he became aware of something else. A deep rumbling, barely perceptible at first, coming from the direction of the central temple, the great fire crystal. They were tuning it again, pushing it to higher frequencies. The Sons of Belial had won another vote in the council, had gained permission to continue their experiments despite protests from the Sons of the Law of One. The rumbling grew stronger. Marin could feel it in his bones, in his teeth, a vibration that didn't feel right, that felt discordant rather than harmonious. Around him, the other keepers of the stars were feeling it too, exchanging worried glances. And then the dome began to shake, not earthquake shaking, but something else. Something that came from the energy grid itself being disrupted. The crystalline structure of the dome resonated with the disturbance, amplifying it, making it visible in ways that stone wouldn't have shown. Karis spoke urgently, telling everyone to evacuate the observatory, to get to lower ground, to move away from the crystalline structures that were resonating with the disruption. The group moved quickly but without panic. trained for emergencies, even though none of them had ever experienced anything quite like this. Marin was one of the last to leave, pausing to grab the most important star charts, the records of thousands of years of observations that couldn't be replaced. He rolled them carefully, placed them in a waterproof tube made of treated leather, and ran for the stairs. But he didn't make it. The disruption reached a critical point, and the crystal in the observatory dome shattered. Not just cracked, but exploded into thousands of fragments. Some flew outward into the night. Others rained down into the observation chamber. Marin felt something hit his back, felt heat and pain. He fell, the tube of charts rolling away from his outstretched hand. He could hear screaming, could hear the roar of energy being released in ways it was never meant to be released. And then, strangely, the pain faded. Marin felt himself lifting away from his body, looking down at the broken form lying on the observatory floor. He'd been killed by a large crystal fragment. Death had been almost instant, but consciousness didn't end. He continued to exist, to observe, now from a perspective that wasn't limited to a single body or single viewpoint. He could see the entire city, could see other structures beginning to fail as the energy grid destabilized. The great fire crystal in the temple had been pushed too far, tuned to frequencies that created destructive interference patterns with Earth's natural resonance. The result was catastrophic. Energy was being released in massive, uncontrolled bursts. The ground itself was beginning to fracture. Marin watched, his consciousness hovering between worlds, as Atlantis began its final days. Not all at once. The complete destruction would take months. But the damage done this night was irreversible. The crystal technology that had powered their civilization for thousands of years had been turned into a weapon of self-destruction. He saw people fleeing, saw ships being loaded with refugees, saw the desperate attempt to save what knowledge they could. Some of the star charts were rescued. He saw them being carried onto ships. Some would survive, would be carried to distant lands, would be passed down through generations of survivors and their descendants. Ancient Egypt would inherit some of this knowledge. So would early Sumerian culture, and the people who would become the Maya, fragments of Atlantean wisdom, distorted by time and cultural change, but still carrying echoes of the truth about the cosmos and humanity's place in it. Marin felt profound grief for what was being lost. Thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, destroyed by pride and the lust for power. But he also understood, from this expanded perspective between death and rebirth, that the loss was temporary. Knowledge could be lost, but consciousness remained. Souls learned and grew, and carried their wisdom forward, even when the physical records were destroyed. He saw his own future, saw that he would incarnate again many times, always carrying somewhere in his soul the memory of Atlantis and the knowledge he'd gained there. In some lifetimes, he'd be drawn to the stars, to astronomy, to understanding the cosmos. In others, he'd work with different aspects of the same truth. But the core knowing would persist, waiting for lifetimes when he was ready to remember. And he saw far into the future, to a lifetime in the late 20th century, to a man named David Harrison, who would be drawn to study ancient astronomy, who would recognize patterns in the stars that he shouldn't be able to recognize, who would eventually undergo regression and remember. This moment, this life, this civilization that history claimed never existed, that future David would have a role to play. Not in rebuilding Atlantis, that era was done, but in helping humanity remember certain truths that had been lost, helping bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern science, helping demonstrate that consciousness and cosmos were connected in ways that materialistic science had forgotten. David gasped as he returned to his body in Dr. Reeves's office. The transition from Marin's death to his own living form, jarring and disorienting. He was shaking, tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the vividness of what he'd just experienced. Dr. Reeves sat quietly, her presence calm and grounding. She'd witnessed many profound regressions, but could tell this one had been particularly intense. "Take your time," she said softly. "You're safe. You're here. Just breathe." David tried to speak but couldn't form words. The experience had been so real, so detailed, so completely unlike anything his imagination could have created. He'd lived years as Marin had experienced an entire civilization, had died and then watched from outside his body as Atlantis began its destruction. When he finally found his voice, the first thing he said was, "The star charts. Some of them survived. That's why ancient cultures have the same astronomical knowledge. They inherited it from Atlantean refugees." Dr. Reeves nodded. Tell me what you experienced. David spent the next hour describing everything, the detail pouring out of him, the observatory, the crystal technology, the sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics and energetic influence, the split between the sons of Belial and the sons of the Law of One, the fatal mistake of pushing the technology beyond safe limits, his death as Marin, and the perspective he gained after Dr. Reeves listened carefully, taking notes. When David finished, she asked, "How do you feel about what you've seen?" David thought about it, validated in a strange way. "I've spent my whole career trying to explain how ancient people had knowledge they shouldn't have had. Now I understand. They didn't develop it independently. They inherited fragments from Atlantis. The mystery isn't how primitive people achieved sophisticated astronomy. The mystery is how much was lost when Atlantis fell." He paused, then added, "But I also feel grief for Marin, for the civilization, for all that knowledge destroyed by hubris and powerless, and I feel responsible, which is weird since it happened 12,000 years ago. But part of me feels like I should have done more, should have fought harder against the sons of Belial." Dr. Reeves smiled gently. "That's a common feeling in past life regression, especially when accessing traumatic deaths. But you need to remember that Marin was one person in a society of millions. You couldn't have changed the outcome alone. And from what you've described, you did what you could. You warned people. You presented evidence to the council. You worked to preserve knowledge even as things were collapsing." Over the following weeks, David's entire relationship with his work changed. He no longer approached ancient astronomy as an academic puzzle to be solved. He understood it as fragments of a lost science that he depersonally contributed to in a previous life. He looked at ancient Egyptian star charts with new eyes, recognizing specific formations that matched what he'd recorded as Marin. He studied Mayan astronomical observations and saw the same patterns, the same sophisticated understanding that couldn't have been developed independently but that made perfect sense as inherited knowledge from a common source. He even found correlation with his own modern observations. The stellar pattern that had felt so familiar, that had triggered his search for answers, was one he'd mapped thousands of years ago as Marin. His current work was literally continuing work he'd started in a previous incarnation. David also began to understand his obsession with Atlantis differently. It wasn't just intellectual curiosity, it was soul memory trying to surface, trying to complete unfinished business, trying to preserve and share knowledge that had been lost. He started writing a book, not framing it as past life memory since that would destroy his academic credibility, but presenting the evidence for a lost source civilization that had achieved sophisticated astronomical knowledge. He could present the data, show the patterns, make the case that ancient cultures had inherited, rather than independently develop their cosmic understanding. The book found an audience beyond academic circles, people who'd always felt drawn to Atlantis, who'd sensed that the legends contained truth, who carried their own soul memories of that time period. David received letters from readers sharing their own experiences, their own memories, their own recognition of the truth he was presenting. Some were clearly fantasizing, creating false memories based on wishful thinking, but others described specific details that matched what David had seen, that couldn't have come from popular culture or common legend. The layout of Poseidia, the crystal technology, the philosophical split between factions, the warning signs in the sky before the final collapse. These people, scattered around the world, were remembering the same civilization. They were part of the same larger soul group, souls who had lived in Atlantis and who had incarnated in the modern era for a purpose: to help humanity avoid making the same mistakes, to reintroduce lost wisdom gradually and carefully, to bridge ancient knowledge and modern science. David also experienced practical benefits from his regression. The chronic anxiety he'd struggled with his entire life lessened significantly. His therapist explained that sometimes anxiety comes from unresolved past life trauma, from souls carrying forward the terror of catastrophic death without conscious awareness of where the fear comes from. By remembering and processing Marin's death, David released trauma he'd been carrying for 12,000 years. The relief was profound. His relationship with his wife improved too. He'd been so consumed by his obsession with ancient astronomy that he'd been emotionally distant, always lost in his research. Now, understanding the bigger picture, he could be more present. His work was still important, but it didn't need to consume him the way it had before. 3 years after his regression, David made a trip to the Atlantic Ocean. to an area researchers had identified as potentially matching the location Plato described for Atlantis. He stood on a boat, looking out at the water, knowing that somewhere beneath those waves were ruins of a civilization that had achieved heights humanity was only beginning to remember. He didn't need physical proof. His memory was proof enough. But he hoped that someday, archaeological evidence would be found that would validate what he and others remembered, not to prove themselves right, but to help humanity understand its true history. To recognize that civilization was not a linear progression from primitive to advanced, but a cycle that had risen and fallen multiple times. David also maintained contact with Dr. Reeves, doing additional regression sessions that filled in more details about his life as Marin and other past lives where he worked with astronomical knowledge. He discovered he'd been an astronomer in ancient Egypt, a Maya calendar keeper, a Babylonian stargazer, the same soul, the same passion, expressing across multiple lifetimes, and he began teaching informally, giving talks at conferences and gatherings, helping others understand that the cosmos was far more than just mechanical interactions of matter and energy. The ancient understanding, the Atlantean knowledge that Marin had worked with, was beginning to be rediscovered by modern science. Quantum physics was revealing that consciousness and matter were intimately connected. Researchers were documenting how solar activity influenced human behavior and health. The old wisdom was being validated by new methods. David's role, he realized, was to help make those connections explicit, to show how ancient astronomical knowledge was unprimitive superstition but sophisticated science that modern civilization was just beginning to understand again, to be a bridge between what was lost and what could be relearned. He thought often about Marin's last moments, about watching Atlantis begin its collapse. The grief remained, but it was tempered by understanding that destruction wasn't final. Civilizations rose and fell, but consciousness persisted. Knowledge could be lost but not destroyed. It waited in soul memory to be rediscovered when humanity was ready. And maybe, just maybe, in this cycle of civilization, humanity would make different choices, would learn to work with nature rather than trying to dominate it, would develop technology in harmony with consciousness rather than trying to separate them, would avoid the hubris that had destroyed Atlantis and countless other civilizations. That was David's hope. That was his mission. To remember, to share, to help humanity learn from the past and choose a different future. The stars are still there, carrying the same patterns Marin mapped 12,000 years ago, in an observatory on an island that no longer exists. The knowledge that Atlantean astronomers accumulated over thousands of years wasn't completely lost. It survived in fragments scattered across ancient cultures in pyramids, precisely aligned with constellations in temples, built to track celestial movements in calendars that encoded sophisticated astronomical understanding. And it survived in soul memory, waiting for people like David to remember, to recognize patterns that feel familiar, because they once recorded them with their own hands in a lifetime before this one. Maybe you're one of them, carrying memories of a civilization that achieved heights we're only beginning to remember. Subscribe for more memories from before the forgetting.